Well, welcome, guys. It's nice to see all of you in person and, that way.
Did you do this haircut all your own?
No.
Okay.
Is this okay with you?
I really
All right,
like
all right,
it,
all right.
but I just didn't know if you thought it up or.
Oh, well, I didn't give myself this haircut.
No,
I thought that's what you meant.
No,
Oh.
somebody went and made that happen. And
Yeah.
You're asking if it was on purpose.
Yeah.
I just think it looks terrific.
Thanks.
I think it looks good too.
Starting off with a seal of approval for Carrie. All right.
So normally when I speak at places, I might have an idea of what I'm going to say. But normally the audience and those listening don't have a clue where I'm going, right? I mean, that's kind of my style. But this time we have a topic. And the topic was simply the purpose of the Christian life. And I was going to start off by just mentioning the fact that if you guys know me at all, some of you do, some of you know me a little less. I'm a pretty big game buff, like board games, all kinds of games. Like if you come over to our house, you can see this whole cabinet that's just stacked full of games. And then we've got a closet upstairs that's stacked full of more games. And believe it or not, that's after we've purged and been like, we need to get rid of some of this stuff because we just have way too many games. And it's trickled down to our boys, and people will come over and we'll buy these new games. And you sit down, and immediately what you find out is you pull out instructions and all this kind of stuff. And the first game for us lately is the game of explaining. That's how it begins. Because the games that we buy are complex. And so you find yourself reading and reading and reading, and then you have to kind of explain that to someone else. And typically in our family, it's like Anne or maybe Silas or maybe Lincoln, who kind of dives into the instructions and then begins telling you about the game. And what you really are thinking the whole time they're explaining all of these complex rules is, what's the point? Like, I mean, you're not even telling me what the point is. You're just explaining the game. You're just telling us about all this stuff, but you haven't given us the point of the game. What's the purpose? That's what I'm thinking the entire time. Now, there was a long time ago I did a talk here at BCM, and I drew a bullseye up on a whiteboard up front. And I was talking about the purpose, the point of all of this. Like, why do this? What are we supposed to be about? What is happening here? Now, what's funny is I'm guessing that the majority of all of us signed up, joined Team Christian with some kind of purpose in mind. You were probably told something at the time, taught something, told something, sold something. Maybe you just assumed something, but there was some kind of purpose going on there. There was this like underneath why I'm becoming a Christian, there's this why I'm becoming a Christian. The why, the purpose. That's kind of what I wanted to talk about tonight. Because I'm guessing that over time, that purpose for you has shifted. It's probably changed somewhat or entirely. And you might not have stopped to think about that or pause and reflect on that to realize that that's actually occurred. And I find that fascinating because it just kind of almost happens to us. It's like the frog in the boiling water. And like the next thing you know, you're like, wait a minute. This whole purpose, the whole point of this, the whole why is like moved. How did that happen? What's that all about? There was this time when I was leading Sky, doing the student program. And we took this trip with all these students and we took them out on a houseboat. And we were out on the houseboat for like 9 days. And there were no cell phones and there's no distractions. And it's just us. And we have all these conversations. And one of the conversations that kept coming up that week was how Phil didn't believe in hell anymore. And that was like interesting because like I kept talking about that. And honestly, people would nudge me and they would be like, wait a minute, so you don't believe in hell anymore? And I'm like, well, I don't even know. You know what I mean? I'm just taking it off the table. Like, I'm not going to be able to prove to you if it is or isn't real. I'm just taking it out of the whole discussion right now. Like, it's not in the purpose for me anymore. It's not a part of that story or narrative. I had one of my leaders at the time come up to me and she said, well, what about this verse? What about this? She started to play that whole game, which I don't enjoy anyway. But she started doing that, and I was like, well, we talked a little bit about it. But at the end of the conversation, here's what she said to me. She just simply said, if there is no hell, what's the point? And I was like, interesting. Okay, now this conversation just got good. Because you're telling me the purpose of the Christian life for you, right, was about avoiding or escaping something called hell. That was fascinating to me, right? So the purpose or the why or the what's going on, like what's the point of this? And so we had this conversation moving forward after that. What's the point of being a Christian if there's no hell? Why would you even be like, that was a fun conversation. So I guess what I wanted to hear from you guys tonight, just to start, I mean, for me, I would love to hear maybe out of your mouths, if you could think back to, if there's been a time in your life that you can remember the purpose or the point of the Christian life for you, and you can remember a point in time when that shifted. Or you can point back and say, well, I know at one point the purpose for me was this, but it's not entirely there. And it doesn't have to be a complete shift. It doesn't have to be a total change. It can just be like a little partial change. And maybe you think of it in terms of this. Like, I mean, it's like, well, it's not all that anymore. It's more. I've added more onto it, right? Because that's still a change. That's still a shift. It's not like you like had this purpose and you just left it. It's like, no, I also picked up this though. And now I've picked up this. And so it's like, it's more. But would anybody can anybody throw something out? Like, I mean, ideas or anything? Like as far as a purpose for you that partially shifted or totally changed or whatever. I just want to hear, because I think it's good for us to hear that from one another. Right? I give you one example, the whole interesting hell piece for me. And I can dive into that more because I can tell you how I grew up and why that was such a thing. But I'm just curious. So just put that out to you guys first.
Ken unmuted. Is he going to say something?
So you can?
Well, I was getting ready in case I wanted to run my mouth. When I came to God, it's in '85. The first thing I started to do was read the Bible. And when I did, I found that every person in the Bible was my friend. As a matter of fact, that was my whole attraction to the Bible. These people are my friends. And so for 8 years, I did everything that I could see doing just in my daily, ordinary life. I did a bunch of writing and made friends and everything in Breckenridge and all of that. So for that first 8 years, I didn't set foot in a church. And then when I had done everything that I figured was at hand for me to do without going to church, I said, well, now's the time to go to church. And so I started to go to church. That first summer, I started off in Frisco, and then I came to BCM that fall. And so it was almost like a graduate school of life in the hand of God when I started to go to church.
That's pretty cool.
What would you say your purpose was or your goal was of being a Christian?
Well, I didn't have a goal in being a Christian. I just came to find that God is true, the Bible is true, and Jesus died so that we might live. And that was great plenty for me. Beyond that, I don't need a purpose. And in fact, to even classify what the purpose might be is starting to hold back on it, because it's like, why do you love your children? Well, here, do you have the next 12 years? I'll tell you about, you can't just categorize something that's so vast.
I grew up in a church where you got the point that you had to figure out how to not go to hell, and then you needed to start caring about your friends so that they didn't go to hell, and telling them, and eventually, of course, they put the whole world on you as far as what you had to do to keep everyone from going to hell. And I would say I had a very gradual move out of that. It just sort of began, like by the time I was in college, began to mean a little less, and then I was kind of driven to find out what did mean something to me. And it took a while to sort of let that go and to sort of fill in what I felt differently about. And I would say mixed in there was certainly stuff about following Jesus and his teachings and that kind of stuff. I mean, that was also in there, but.
I mean, I think for me growing up in church culture in Minnesota, I mean, I remember like getting baptized, saying a prayer, and it was, to go to heaven. I think was probably the primary reason. So there's the undercurrent of where are you trying to not go? It's like these two options. So I know that there was, the nuance of I didn't want to go to hell, wanted to go to heaven instead. And then I think secondary to that was like the whole personal relationship with Jesus. That was really big in my family and in my church growing up. And I would definitely say some of those things have changed probably a lot since coming out here and doing Sky together. A lot of that stuff we rethought and let go of some things and emphasized probably, I would say now, or maybe over the last 20 years living here, it's been more about trying to live the life that God designed for us to live. I guess if I had to define it, maybe.
So you should tell Tony what the questions were. Kind of looks like he's in a spaceship or something.
Oh, what's up, Tony?
Hey, sorry, I'm just joining. I'm in the middle of painting my girls' bunk room bed, so I'm gonna.
All good.
Yeah.
All good. So I kind of threw out the question. I was asking people to think back, like over the years of like living a Christian life, and to think back to some of the various like purposes that have really like become central, or kind of like, I don't know, kind of guided and kind of steered you in the Christian life. It's kind of like looking for those purposes that like pop up, that like you would be like, oh yeah, this is like the thing. This is what that's about. This is what we should chase after. This is why I'm a Christian, you know, the why beneath it.
Got it.
And I did want to throw out there that, like, I'm all for the shifting. Like, in case you can't gather that already, like, I think the purpose of the Christian life is dynamic. I think intentionally so. I think it is a moving target. I think it is something that shifts and evolves, and rightfully so. So, I mean, you can, like, change my mind on that. That's cool. But I would just love to hear, like, some that maybe were earlier in your stages of faith, some that maybe are current, any of them.
I know that I always bristled under the them and us.
Uh-huh.
I didn't, I mean, we became Christians when, like, my parents went forward at a Billy Graham crusade and then just kind of hit the ground running. And my dad never, I mean, he always included everybody in everything. He never wanted to be told these people were right or wrong. And I remember then I went to Wheaton College, where it was all predicated on them and us. And you got to get out there and get them. And then I came out here and I taught with this wonderful group of teachers that would have laid down their life for any kid. And I remember 4 of us took a trip to Boston, and we were eating dinner one night in some restaurant, and one of my friends just said, "Do you really believe that if I don't say this prayer or whatever?" And there'd been a fire in our hotel and we had to get out in the middle of the night and the whole thing, and so we were like,
Oh my gosh.
And she just looked at me and she said, "Do you think I'd go to hell, like if we burn up?" And I just looked at her, I said, "No." I said, "My God wouldn't leave you hanging." And I just remember that like, they were like really profound things. And I would often say to John how, I mean, it was kind of a theme.
Yeah.
And I will always remember reading, and of course I can't remember the title, but that first Brian McLaren book, same kind of different as me, or what is it? Some kind of Christian like me. What?
New kind of Christian.
Yeah, and that was a really large part of his whole book. Like, guess what? We're all going, and God loves all of us. And I just remember I was sitting in the bathtub where I often read, and I just bawled because it was like that so resonated that I was able to just like drop all that. But there really isn't of them and us. And that to me was very freeing. It also allows you to learn from everybody else.
Yeah.
Just because they don't have some doctorate in this theology or feel this way. I mean, you watch people in action and the love they extend, and you're like, well, that is so humbling. They're way more Christ-like than somebody I was supposed to watch or listen to.
I had a similar background, I think. Very conservative, and it was all about going to heaven, though. We didn't talk about hell very much. It was more about going to heaven.
Right. Yeah.
But,
So that's a different perspective. That's a much different purpose.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I remember always being like, well, what about now? What are we supposed to do here now? Is it all about heaven? Aren't we supposed to do something now? And then to piggyback on you just a little bit, I remember when we were in Japan, and I just remember the culture was so different. And I remember, well, there were no Christians. I mean, we didn't know any Christians at all. Right. I mean, there was like no churches. There were temples, but not, anyway.
But the culture was very much, if the nail is sticking up, pound it down. You weren't supposed to be different. You weren't supposed to be.
Yeah.
And I just thought, how are Christians supposed to like take over and like push their religion on these people? That is so ingrained. And I thought that God can't condemn them because that's their culture. You can't just put them all in hell because they have no chance. That's just not right. That's not fair. And I remember that kind of shifting my whole idea, and I totally changed that idea. And I don't know. My faith is constantly evolving, I think, in different ways.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Carrie. Thank you. It's really cool.
I noticed a little shift in the discussion. You have brought in the motivation of avoiding hell. To me, that's a little bit foreign, but it's a very interesting part of the discussion. I think if you were going to ask most Christians in most churches, they'd have that topic very much in the forefront. In my case, I never had to worry about that because before I came to God, I didn't care about anything like hell. And in order for me to come to God, I had to become the other. I had to become the ones who were going to burn forever in hell. And I recognized that I was in that group, and that's when I became earnest about God. And he saved me anyhow. So I'm not worried about it. I never was worried about it. It's a little different motivation than I often hear from such as Carrie's talking about with the Billy Graham approach.
I will say, Terry, I really related to the us and them thing that you said. Like, I have this memory of when I was in a youth group in high school, and my youth pastor, it was like a kind of a smaller group kind of thing where we it wasn't like all the games and stuff kind of stuff that you might have at a typical youth group, but it was like a smaller thing where we were having like what I guess would be a heavier discussion for high school kids. And my youth pastor said, if you could ask God one thing, what would it be? And, you know, I had my whole perspective that I'd been given and that was kind of in me at the time, that was about this whole kind of like you're in or you're out, you're saved or you're not kind of stuff. And I said that I would, everybody else was like, what happens when, you know, it was like, what happens when, like, I don't know, when you die or this or that. And so mine was, can I bring all my friends to heaven? That was my thing. You know, that I asked my, you know, that's what I would ask God. And at any rate, I give that story. I say that story because I have been joking around with friends for a while now, saying I want to write a book called Your Questions Suck to Me. And the reason is because like all these the things that were given to me as questions and the things that were given to me as like, this is what this is about. I haven't jived with those being what it's about or being like important since I was in high school. I had a sense of like, somehow when we talk about Christianity and stuff, somehow there's a Christianity that exists that everybody understands and knows and can kind of talk about and say, like, this is what Christianity is about. And somewhere along in high school, I started having the feeling that, like, if this is what Christianity is about and what people say it is and what the important things are, how come none of it's about what Jesus talked about?
Right.
And it's been a thing for me forever, honestly, now, to say, like, I just don't understand. Like, we have the weirdest religion where we say we follow this guy who never talked about any of the stuff that we say is important. And I run into it all the time. I recently ran into it again, where I got in some strange conversation with a guy who was going on and on with me about, and I was just listening to him, but going on and on to me about how Jesus talked about heaven way more than he talked about hell. I mean, he talked about hell way more than he talked about heaven.
Right.
And I remember being like, really? That's funny. I mean, it's like, I'm actually happen to be one of the people who studied the ancient languages and stuff here, and you can't even find the word hell. It doesn't exist in the ancient languages. So what is he talking about? Why is that the thing? And why is this idea of, like, what happens after you die? How does that become the thing that defines Christianity and what it means when like Jesus only ever talked about that stuff just in a precursory way when other people brought it up, and it's been weird for 30 years now to try and talk with people about that, because, like, I don't know, he talks about that all the time, weeping and gnashing of teeth or whatever, but it's like, oh yeah, I don't understand. He never said the word hell. He's not saying he's talking about hell there. It's not in there. It's like a big interpretation that everybody puts on it. We're talking about, when people are in pain and there's weeping and gnashing of teeth, he's talking about some eternal place of burning fire, Well, man, it's just not in there. So for me, what does it mean to be a Christian now? Means, like, can we actually talk about the things that Jesus talked about, as opposed to all these things that everybody puts on it? I years ago, I did a little kids talk at BCM, and I brought up this poem that Shel Silverstein wrote about putting a brassiere on a camel. And I don't know if you've ever read that poem, a little limerick, but it's like, talks about the absurdity. They had to put a bra on a camel because he's got two humps, and they made these other rules to put on this camel. And I just feel like I feel like that's what my experience for 30 years has been with most of Christianity, is like, Christianity is this thing where we put a bra on Jesus, And so for me, what does it mean to be a Christian today? What are the things that last? It's the things that Jesus actually spoke about, not the things that we throw on, not the things that it's really strange to me to have a whole religion based on a guy who never talked about pretty much anything that people say that's what's the important stuff. Does that make any sense, what I'm saying? I can't think of another scenario in life where you have that, where you have, like, oh yeah, I follow this guy, whatever it is. I follow Einstein. No, E equals MC squared. I don't know what that is. I don't believe 2 + 2 = 4, but I follow Einstein. But that's kind of what we've got with Christianity, is this thing where the stuff that Jesus actually talked about is secondary, and there's all this layers of everything else that gets put onto it, and that's what's supposed to be important. So
I hear what you're saying, Tony. I hear what you're saying. And I do kind of feel like we're also watching Bob Ross right now. But At the same time, like it's kind of like there are purposes that we've seen or experienced or felt throughout our lives. Some of those purposes really click at a certain point in time or at a certain stage of faith. Or there are others that we feel like we almost outgrow. There are others that you bump up against and they don't quite feel right at the same time. Like it's kind of like, there's all this stuff kind of floating out there and you're like, but wait a second. Like, and sometimes you question those and sometimes like you really rally to certain ones and they make sense. Like, I feel like purpose is dynamic. I feel like at the same time, it has a lot to do with context. It has a lot to do with context. That can be your tribe or whatever, your community. That can be the culture you find yourself in. That can be the time in history. That can be the time in life, the season of life. That can also be like your stage of faith. Like it can really be contextual, the purpose that you find yourself bumping up against, the purpose that you find yourself relating to, the purpose that you can really embrace. And it suddenly makes sense. I mean, I loved what you said, like it felt freeing. It felt like, it's like you bump up against this purpose and suddenly it redefines it all again in a whole new lens that allows you to step out in a way that like just 10 years ago wouldn't even have seemed possible. And I find that exhilarating, like in the Christian faith. I think it's great that it can keep unfolding, that it can keep like becoming new again in certain kinds of ways. And in no way, like, I mean, you mentioned Billy Graham, I'm the kind of guy that's like, I try not to knock, you know what I mean? Because like I feel like so many of us are doing what we feel like we should be doing at our time and space and place, And so like I find it refreshing to keep examining what is the purpose of my Christian life right now. Like I love to come back to that on a yearly basis and kind of deconstruct and reimagine and be like, so what is it now? And I mean, one of the things I wanted to throw out for you guys, the past year and a half has been quite interesting, to say the least, on so many different levels of society and culture and just like feeling. And I mean, you can look back across your entire spiritual life and you can say, all right, how's my purpose shifted? And what's been the context? What was the catalyst that kind of like brought on that shift or change in purpose? It's also interesting to say, oh my God, the last year and a half, how has that impacted my purpose in Christian life? Because I would almost guarantee if you would sit down and think about the last year and a half, your purpose has shifted in some kind of a way. Like, and again, you might be in the middle of it, and it might not be like actually solidified in some kind of a way, but I'm guessing it has shifted. When there comes like those monumental shifts and change, like it affects the purpose of our Christian life. We start to see things kind of differently. And I wanted to put that out to you guys tonight. I'm not sure that you're going to have like any kind of crazy immediate answer or anything, but that was one of my big questions. Two of my big questions was just like after the past year and a half, considering the pandemic, how has the Christian purpose shifted for you in any kind of a way? The second one was, if you consider the whole idea or concept of the universal Christ, how can you imagine that impacting the purpose of the Christian life? Like, I mean, I love when you were talking about Japan, like, and you were talking about like, so this whole group of people, like when being different, like, I mean, does does the salvation of those people really hinge on us being obnoxious enough to say, by the way, right? Do you know what I mean? Like, so sometimes that kind of stuff is interesting to me. So the universal Christ and like stepping back and like, whew, okay, so like, how does that impact purpose?
What do you mean by universal Christ?
So, well, I think John and some people read a book here called The Universal Christ. I believe it was by Rohr, yeah?
Yeah.
Rohr's book. How would you...
Tom, you're good at explaining it.
Yeah, Tom, summarize or give us the 30-second synopsis on Universal Christ.
Oh, my.
I mean, you've got 30 seconds.
It's kind of a big concept, but it's it's the idea that everything, the stars, matter, energy, humans, animals, trees, the planets, everything is a part of Christ. That's Christ. Christ encompasses all those things. Is universal, and that's probably a very poor description of that. But another way that's phrased is the cosmic Christ, and that we're all a part of it. Whether you're Christian or not, we're all a part of it. We're all part of this universal truth. That's probably pretty poor. John, give it a shot.
Well, it's kind of a much bigger picture of God. And so to be simple, it's like God revealed himself through creation. And so God is kind of in every part of creation and people and everything he created. And then again, God revealed himself through Jesus. And between those two things, that sort of informs us about what our faith would be and what kind of happened. It's a much bigger picture where you think that God is in all of us, not just the evangelical Christians, not just the Americans, but everyone in this world. And it sort of changes everything about how you see faith. Then when you go back and look at a lot of religion, you realize how much empire and power has sort of influenced what Jesus's message was to us and sort of took a lot of it over in ways that were not really good for that. And so it's kind of like stepping back to see the beauty in a way that sort of incorporates everyone.
Rohr would say that the first incarnation was creation, and then Jesus was actually the second incarnation. So when you look at the word incarnation, it means God inhabiting something, and Rohr would say that the creation of the universe is God's first incarnation.
And all of it gets around to the point of that so much of what we've heard is that we're separated from God, that God is out there somewhere and we're here, and we need to figure out a way to be connected with God. And this is just saying like that God is not separated from the start. It's not like we were born into sin, but we were born into goodness. And it's a whole sort of broader, different way of seeing faith that at this point in my life has a lot more meaning. And everything we grew up with, where it came from, and it made sense in terms of what we knew at that point. But I think there's more to know.
I think in the world that we live in, there's a lot of complex issues, a lot of complex problems. Everybody's always looking for the quick fix, the hack, the answer, the one size fits all, that kind of a thing. And sometimes when I think about purpose for the Christian life, I just don't think there's that one size fits all. Right? Like I just don't think you can I just don't think that works. And that's like why I keep bumping back up into this idea of it being dynamic and trying to figure out a way. Like I just kept thinking about it today. Like my thing over the past like month has been at one point during my Christian life, one of my purposes was justice and the end of oppression. Okay? That was like the purpose of the Christian life. That's what it was. I don't want kids to be homeless on the street. I want to figure that out. You know what I mean? And as I've thought about that, as I've gotten older, I'm like, what really is our response to what we would call evil? What's the Christian response? And that's Tony, that's where I would follow. Like, I feel like we come up with everything but Jesus' answer to like the response to evil. We come up with all these cool ways to respond to it, but none of them are the way he chose to respond. Because the way that he chose to respond looks an awful lot like failure. It looks an awful lot like surrender and powerlessness and defeat. So what? You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And so sometimes, like you come up, there's like the purpose of the Christian life that makes my head hurt. There's the purpose of the Christian life that like I can rally around and embrace and carry. And there's the stuff that I still don't understand. And so for me, I was just thinking about this today, and one of the things that I did want to share with you guys was simply that I like this kind of aspect of, if I'm going to define the purpose of my Christian life, I want it to be broad, and I also want it to be very, 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 very specific at the same time, which is kind of weird, but if I break it down for you, I think you'll get what I'm saying here. I often rally around, when I talk to the Sky students and just in my own life, it was when Jesus was approached and the guy was basically like, hey, so like, what do we have to do? Like, what do we have to do to make this work? What's the point, Jesus? Like, just tell us what to do. And he spoke about 2 commands. And he basically said, off of these 2 things, everything else hinges. And they were very broad. Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love others as you love yourself. Do these 2 things. Okay, so that's pretty broad, right? Like that's generous. At the same time, it's pretty specific too. Right? Like I think we can really kind of know when we're doing that really well, and when we're also kind of straying and almost doing what Tony said and adding on all this other stuff that is probably what we're drumming up, probably what we're attaching to it. I thought someone was going to say something. But in that kind of thinking, for me, I mean, man, trying to really break it down and keep it like broad, get specific, keep it like wide, but narrow, keep it like, when I'm talking about the purpose of the Christian life, and I love thinking about the cosmic Christ. For me, that whole idea of love keeps coming back up. Keeps coming back up. And like all these other things, like I wrote down a bunch, because for me, my purpose is, I mean, it was definitely about escaping hell, avoiding hell. Like I grew up, there was some show that was on that they would show in the churches, and it was like, you go to bed and like every night, like, you know what I mean? Make sure you were forgiven and you said, I'm sorry. And like, you know what I mean? Like, cause like, what if, I don't know, the thief in the night kind of stuff. You know what I mean? It was definitely about getting into heaven. It was definitely at one point, it was definitely about like evangelizing, becoming a missionary and like making the rest of the world know what the answer that we've got. Then it was like more about like churchianity, like it became more like about like building churches and like supporting this kind of a system and making sure that like we've got this presence. And I remember in college studying John Piper, and the sole purpose of the human existence is what? To worship and glorify God. We can sum it up in those words. And then like the older I've gotten, it's more about like these words about becoming Christ-like, or like or enlightenment, or we're discovering this stuff. But we stumbled upon a motto for Summit County Youth like a few years ago, well, a bunch of years ago now that we said, and we just told students to live in love, just to live in love, just to live in love. Like you're here, you're breathing, you're gonna live, and what's your purpose? Like love, 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 love. And like, how can we? And then it does become a little bit tricky after that, right? But in my own life, being specific and going through the stages that I'm at and the different contexts I'm in, I find that I can always keep coming back to that. That seems to fit. That seems to like work. That seems to be inclusive. And it seems to be that kind of essence of like what Carrie was talking about. For me, when I look at that purpose, it sets me free. It doesn't bog me down. It actually enables me to like take action in the world and exist in a way that like lifts my heart and propels me forward. So it's that kind of purpose for the Christian life. Does that click with anybody else? Like, does that make sense or like resonate? I'm just curious.
Well, from Bob Ross over here.
Yeah, right. You tell him who that was.
I connect with all of that a lot, Phil. And you mentioned like the whole story about, what's required for when they're rich, they call him the rich young ruler or whatever, what's required for eternal life is what he asks Jesus. And Jesus says, well, the commandments, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
And the guy's like, oh, I've done all that stuff, And then Jesus tells him like, well, then you only lack one thing, give everything and sell it to the poor. Mm-hmm. And come follow me. And the interesting thing is that the very next story is about Zacchaeus. And Zacchaeus, Jesus likes like, I'm going to come dine at your house or whatever. And then Zacchaeus has this experience where it's something important happens to him. And he's like, oh, I'm going to give back everything that I wronged people. And I'm also going to give half of what I've got before. And Jesus is like, oh yeah, well, salvation came to this guy. And here you have two different guys, and Jesus gives them two different answers. One guy, he says, give away everything. The other guy says he's going to give away half, and Jesus is like, oh yeah, you're saved. And so I really resonate with what you said about it's dynamic, it's changing, and maybe even it's specific to people, because there's two guys in stories right after each other, and Jesus prescribes two different things, and calls both of them salvation. And so I really relate to that. And I think the questions that come up for us can be really funny. And I go back to, I mean, I think they come to us through culture and experience or whatever, but I personally often come back to the story of the prodigal son, which is a super interesting story. Growing up, we never talked about the older brother when I story, but we only ever talked about the son left and did all these stupid things with what he had been given, you know. And he's like eating the pig's food and all this kind of stuff because he's got so desperate. But what's really interesting to me in that story that I come back to nowadays, and I feel like I have for a really a long while, is that the older brother kind of gripes and grumbles to the father about like, hey, like, what are you doing killing this fatted calf and having this big feast? I've been here all along doing all the stuff that you wanted. And the father in the story is like, yeah, you know, everything I have is yours, and it always has been. And I realize like both brothers, everything is right there, and neither of them take it, and neither of them accept it, and neither of them participate. They both do not participate in their own personal way, you know. The older son doesn't participate because he's like self-righteous and you know, stuck in thinking it's about doing all these things just this way and whatever. And the younger doesn't participate because he doesn't see it as good what he's got, and so he's going to go get all this other stuff. But either way, it doesn't really matter. The point isn't that like some guy spent his fortune on wild living. It's that neither of them participated in what they already had. And it's so funny, what an amazing story to have people coming from this idea of righteousness and the stuff that you were taught, or at least I was taught coming up in church, this was all the stuff that's important, purity and righteousness, etc. And like, you know, the older son had all of that, but he still didn't get to participate because he wouldn't participate. The younger son had like gone off and, you know, squandered everything, but he didn't participate. So whether it was through what somebody would call wild living or something, or whether it was through righteousness, neither participated in what they already had. It didn't have to do with some story about being separate from God or taken, you know, God couldn't stand you. No, the truth was the father in that story, he could stand both of them the whole time. They just couldn't stand the gift that was right there in front of them, and they weren't partaking in it, you know. One because he was too good for it, and one because he thought something else was better, you know. But either way, it's like you're there, the goodness is there, the Father is there. You're not separated or broken apart from or anything like that. You're just not participating in what's there. There's a feast there and you're not participating, you know. So I guess I mentioned that because you were saying what endures for you earlier. That's what endures for me, is that it's there. There's all the goodness is there right now, right in front of me. So it's not like I'm separated from it, and it's not like I have to be some way to be a part of it. It's just there, and God's been there the whole time. I don't know if that makes any sense, but Bob Ross.
I personally love the idea that I think I heard it at least growing up, you know what I mean? That the Holy Spirit will do in your life what needs to be done to like help grow you, help teach you, help you deepen, you know what I mean? In the knowledge and the experience of the love of God, you know? And when I think about the purpose of the Christian faith, what what sometimes I guess rubs me the wrong way is that we slap a purpose on it when the purpose can seem all over the place, and it can seem broad enough to be like, yeah, love God and love other people as you love yourself, but at the same time it can be very, very specific for each of us in our own individual context. And lots of times I would leave that specificity up to like the mystery of the Holy Spirit. And what's cool about it is, I mean, I don't know if you guys have ever heard people say, you know, the only constant in life is change, right? Change. And I'm a firm believer in that one, because like I'm 43 now and I'm no longer 30 and I can feel it, you know, like stuff has changed. My oldest is living in LA now and he's not home, and it's changed and it's weird. But what's interesting to me is the purpose of the Christian faith for me continues to change. And I believe that's a good thing. I believe that's progression. I believe that's growth. I believe that's a necessary evolution in my personal spiritual faith and journey. So I would encourage you, as you bump up against things, or as the last year and a half has possibly shifted purpose and left you with a question mark, or you find yourself in a period where you honestly couldn't answer that question, what is the purpose of the Christian faith? And you're like, I don't know anymore. That's okay. Like that's the change that's happening to us. That's what we're experiencing. And to flip it on the side real quick, I mean, I'm in love with this John Bellion song right now that says, nothing has changed, he is the same. What's interesting is I really believe that. I really believe the purpose of the Christian faith keeps changing because it's God's revelatory nature to bring us further and further and further and deeper and deeper and deeper. And while we're changing, he is absolutely the same. It's just we're on this progress. We're on this journey. We're on this road where we keep learning more and more. We see love in different ways. We experience it and understand it slightly different. And that's a very, very good thing, that the purpose of the Christian life continues to kind of like, I don't know, it's not that it eludes us, but it's just like that it just becomes more. It just becomes more. And that's a good thing. So, I'm not going to keep everybody forever. What time is it? I mean, it's already been like 50 years. But, I mean, oh, I saw you. I thought you were going to talk, man.
No,
I thought you were going to say something.
I'm
man.
going to talk.
Well, I think the loving God and loving others as you love yourself is great because it is broad, but everyone interprets that in your own life and context in a different way.
Agreed.
And it kind of leaves room for us to do that.
And I think God keeps finding ways to reveal himself to us in our context. And if anything has changed in our world, it's our context from about the year 2000 on, as far as that's with the entire world, the internet, I mean, just so much stuff has changed. I think God has and will continue to reveal what's important for the context we find ourselves in. And that's on a broader scale, and it's also individual.
I think in Jesus's discussion with the rich young ruler, he said to the rich young ruler, you lack one thing.
Yep.
Give all that you have to the poor. So what I see there is salvation is never for the person involved. That is not the point. If a Christian's point is fire insurance, then basically they got a bag of wind. But the Christian life is for one another. Okay? And you see that with Zacchaeus again. Zacchaeus was praised by Jesus because Zacchaeus says, I give half of what I do to the poor. He didn't say, if you praise me, I'll give half. He says, I give. And so he was outside of himself with his membership in the kingdom of heaven. So membership in the kingdom of heaven, as I see it, never is about me, myself, and I. It may be about me, but the only reason is that it's about one another.
You like that phrase, one another?
I certainly do.
I often love to look at the Bible, and obviously I'm a Rob Bell fan, and everybody knows that. But
You're what?
a Rob Bell fan. Do you know Rob Bell? He's an author.
He's a writer.
He's an author, and several times it's like a beginning and an end approach. And I often love to think of the Bible that way. And you're always like, you look at the beginning and there's a garden, and there's a community of life, and you have keepers and caretakers, essentially, of the community of life. And then you fast forward to the end of the Bible, and it's like the garden's transformed into a city, but it's still a community of life, and still these keepers and caretakers. And in that picture, for me, I always find one another. I always find this concept of withness. It's like we're with the community of life. Like we're a part of it. We're built into it. And here we are with one another. And that concept of learning to love is pretty profound. Because I think a lot of times we learn how to abuse, how to take advantage of, how to be very selfish, how to not think of the broader picture of the good big picture, and that kind of a thing. So for me, that's pretty strong. I like that idea of one another, Ken.
Ken, I loved what you said too. Just something I had to tell myself a long time ago, and that I repeat to myself all the time, is just get over yourself. The idea that this is about me, or about some, I think the word you used is salvation or whatever, is about me. It's just I love the one another idea, and just getting over myself. It's all good. I just come back to that prodigal son thing. The party's already there. It's not about me. It's about the party together. And no matter where I am in life, the party's still there, and I can participate, and I can be a part of it with other people, and I can help to enjoy the party myself, and help others to come to the party and enjoy it. But it's just not about me. So anyway, I really appreciate what you said.
I was going to add one last thing about the purpose quick. Earlier in my life, in my 20s and 30s, the purpose of the Christian life was almost like a to-do checklist. It was something that I could actually physically accomplish. You know what I mean? I had the energy, I had the time, I was gonna finish whatever the purpose was. It was able to happen. And I think as the older I've gotten, just piggybacking on what Tony was saying, I'm more a part of something bigger. And that purpose probably isn't going to be accomplished in my short little blip lifespan. Like, I'm not so sure that like whatever it is could happen that quickly. I remember taking a trip with Sky students and we worked on these houses in Guatemala, and it was Michael Dudek, and we finished our work there 9 days, whatever, 14 days. And he was so frustrated because we had finished a couple of walls on one of the houses. And he was like, Phil, this sucks. Like, I thought we were going to build a house, man. We didn't even get a roof on while we were here. And I was like, only we would be thinking that way, like back up like 100, 200 years. Building projects didn't happen in someone's lifetime. Like it didn't get finished, and we're such like creatures of wanting like that product and that end result. And I think the longer we all live, we start to recognize we're just a part of something. Like we're in the middle somehow. And somehow that process like is specific to us and our transformation while we're here, but that purpose is bigger and it also continues. And it's beyond us. And it's like lifetimes. It's lifetimes. It's a pretty fantastic big story. So all I wanted to encourage you guys tonight was to really stop and reflect and maybe think a little bit about purpose, the purpose of your Christian life and what that looks like, and to consider the context that you find yourselves in currently. Just with the past year and a half, as well as like whatever stage or season of life you find yourself in, and to also be encouraged that it's a pretty great thing when that purpose is shifting, and that it's okay, and that it also should be an encouraging thing. It should be a life-giving thing, because probably on the other side, some of the best purposes I've seen are freeing, life-giving, and like exciting. And yeah, so.